This is an excellent book. I will tell you that. It is really an excellent book, and it is a book that came from a series of lectures. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then went through a long process of review to get to a university press and through that. But it is really a good book. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight. And I can see some people who should have been co-authors as I look around the room. I think, why aren't you in this book, Jeff? Well, that's well. Anyway, but the book is really good. And what we'd like to do is start by having, we have the co-editors and several of the authors, and I would like to have those folks, each of them will be reading a tiny bit from each of their essays, but I would like to have them all come down here and stand like birds on a wire here, or peacocks on a wire, and just have a moment where we all look at you and clap for you here, because here is a Senate of the American West team, and if you would all just, woohoo, stand like a bird on a wire. Stand like a bird on a wire, peacock on a wire, that's it. And then
I get it. It's a photo.
It is a photo op. Right, so look at this group. Woohoo, look at that. Right. We're using their wide-angle lens, I think, on that. So, yay. Okay, great. Okay, so you'll hear more about and hear a teeny bit from each of these individuals in a moment, but they'll return to their seats, and I will start us off here with just a sense of how interesting this book is. And I shall begin by reading just a little bit of, I'll just tell you the opening. This is my prologue from the beginning, and then I'll read a little part about explaining how this book came to be. But I'm starting with this little part from my prologue just to indicate that this really is quite a peppy book. Okay, so an old man in Missouri had started into a steep decline, and his doctor had tried every treatment he could imagine. At last, he suggested what many physicians in the eastern United States had told desperate patients. The only hope remaining was a relocation to the arid, sunny, healing West. So the invalid packed up and moved to Santa Fe, but the effort came too late. He had barely arrived in New Mexico when his decline accelerated. Treated by an artful embalmer, he was soon on his way back to Missouri in a coffin. In his hometown, at the open casket funeral, two old friends stood over him. "Don't he look good?" one of them said. "Yep," said the other. "Santa Fe done him a world of good." So that is an opening that begins with how the West had been seen as a place of healing, and then various troubles and dilemmas came upon the West, and now the West seems to be more the recipient than the deliverer of the healing. So I'm going to read just a tiny bit here about how this book came to be, and then others will, I think alphabetical order is a very inspired form of sequence. So Sharon will speak after me, right? Is that right?
No, I go after the authors read their essay.
I beg your pardon. Yes. So we'll enjoy alphabetical order. I will read this, and then we'll just have a festival of alphabetical order so you can get a sense of the spectrum of these essays. And again, I will say that what's so striking about these is that these are all essays about recovering from amnesia, facing up to the injuries of the past, and then moving on to resolution, remedy, restoration, repair. So it's really a wonderful antidote to fatalism and gloom, even though, again, it does involve a very frontal confrontation with these troubles. So here is a little segment that explains how this book came to be. Every time I find this, I lose this again. Okay, this little section is called Healing Higher Education, or How This Book Came to Be. Among the many happy side effects of projects undertaken to heal the West, none means more to me than the parallel and connected restoration of health to higher education. Here I speak for myself and not necessarily for my co-editors or any of the contributors to this volume, though quite a few of the writers here make references to the negative appraisal that, quote, applied, unquote, work can receive from convention-based systems of appraising scholarly work. Nevertheless, not everyone shares the idea that universities have been ailing. As a person whose primary home has been a university since 1968, However, I contemplate the current state of higher education with a feeling that matches the concern provoked by realizing that an old friend is not looking well and does not seem interested in getting a checkup. In the past 40 years, the world of technology, of child raising, of authority and credentialing, of professions and occupations has changed tremendously. The practices, customs, and habits of most professors have, in contrast, changed to a much more limited degree. A loyalty to narrow academic specialization is rigorously passed on to each generation of professors, and disciplines fragment into ever narrower territories of expertise. In nearly every field, a distinction between pure research and applied work puts the latter at a disadvantage. Perhaps most troubling of all, academic practice seems stuck in the rut of addressing a tiny audience of fellow specialists. Many erstwhile reformers concerned about these patterns have called for a change in the reward system. Indeed, there are many good arguments in favor of a shift away from the basing of hiring, tenure, and promotion on conventional research and toward the valuing of innovative and energetic teaching and applied knowledge. But such projects run smack into the unmovable wall of customary practice. Anyone in need of a prime example of the meaning of the phrase, "old habits die hard," should hot-foot it to the nearest university. This will not be universally popular, I think, as I read this. This is not going to be admired everywhere. But the good news is that anyone in need of a prime example of the willingness and capability of some faculty to adapt nimbly to the times, to live in the 21st century, and to match their academic knowledge to practical needs would be well served by a visit to the University of Colorado and the professors associated with the Center of the American West. All colleges and universities have several faculty cohorts similar to this group, experimenting with conspicuous success in a fresher, more connected, more engaged, more satisfying form of professional life. If the existence and numbers of these lively and valuable scholars could be more widely known, public appreciation and support of higher education might well rise. This book proves my point. In January 2002, we undertook to choose a theme for a year-long Center of the American West faculty lecture series co-sponsored by the Chancellor's Office. We considered some good candidates for topics: fire and western wildlands, western water, transportation in the West, western energy production and consumption, and remedy, repair, restoration, mitigation, remediation. In an email message describing those choices, I annotated that last topic. All over the West, people are trying to do more than lament injury. From the hope of restoring damaged ecosystems and wildlife habitats to the effort to revitalize Indian languages, there are many dimensions to this vision. A series on this theme would certainly carry a positive and help-filled note. So we settled on the theme of restoration, remedy, and repair. Next, the lecture series acquired the title Healing the West. Then a broad email invitation to the Boulder faculty brought the happy result of an overabundance of responses, enough recruits for 2 years' worth of lectures. Actually, the best response was Joe Ryan, who said, "I work on these things. Why are you looking for me?" So, but that had well, that's just email. You can't tell tone in an email. Humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, and engineering were all well represented, and the people working in these various territories shared a remarkable similarity of spirit. They convened on a couple of occasions to explore their common interests and commitments. They attended each other's lectures, and then when it came time to turn the lectures into a book, they responded with great goodwill and cheerful effort. No administrator or official had coordinated these individual professors' decisions to take up work in restoration, remedy, repair, and mitigation. They were all good citizens as well as good scholars, and when their scholarly work turned out to hold the promise of considerable benefit to society, they took the situation as an invitation, not a burden. Thus, it is striking to see how well the chapter's common themes, from a spectrum, again, of disciplines across natural sciences, engineering, social sciences, and humanities, it's striking to see how those common themes come together and how they carry hope and promise for healing higher education. Many of the authors here want to cure amnesia and restore memory so that Westerners will be able to reflect and act intelligently, recognizing how their conduct today connects to the history of their region. The same exercise would surely deepen and enrich our thinking about the adaptations higher education has and has not yet made to changing times. The West's universities and colleges are extraordinary resources. In the early 21st century, they are dramatically underutilized resources, and by virtue of being underutilized, they are also undervalued. As faculty and students become more and more engaged with the world around them, higher education itself gains in health and energy. This book exemplifies the best of what university communities can be. So that is why I'm so proud to be associated with this. And in my epilogue, I take off on the notion that there are hundreds of book discussion groups all around the country today, and yet no one really has time to read a whole book. So I propose paragraph discussion groups and page discussion groups. And so at the end, there's like 8 or 9 excellent suggestions. So if you would like to have a book discussion group, but you cannot imagine how you would ever have time to have a book discussion group, you can break this book into little segments and have your paragraph discussion group. So I'm so proud to be associated with these scholars, and it's so much the dream of universities that I had as a young person that I get to see realized here. And now, I think in alphabetical order, is that acceptable? Which would certainly put Len in an important leadership position here. Okay, so here is Len Ackland, who has written on Rocky Flats and the issues around the memory of Rocky Flats.
First seat, first row. Story of my life in school. This week we celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall. It symbolizes the end of the Cold War, which really spawned the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant, which is just a few miles south of here. The Rocky Flats nuclear weapons complex produced tens of thousands of plutonium bombs for the U.S. nuclear arsenal from 1952 to 1989, poisoned hundreds of workers, and contaminated the environment with radioactive and toxic substances. Now, however, most of the grassy mesa south of here, where the controversial bomb plant was located, has been turned into a national wildlife refuge. And if the U.S. Department of Interior's Fish and Wildlife Service gets its way, this 8-square-mile refuge will even offer restricted public use, such as bicycle trails and hunting. A normalized Rocky Flats will become just another piece of open space along Colorado's Front Range. Now, the Department of Energy, through its well-named Office of Legacy Management, was forced to keep ownership of 20% of the site due to contamination problems. And in seeking to manage the site's legacies, the DOE is discouraging the public from remembering and considering the broad historical legacies of Rocky Flats. The legacies are both physical and perceptual. In addition to the contaminated environment, one legacy is physical illness. Hundreds of the more than 20,000 production workers employed at Rocky Flats over the years have been affected by chronic beryllium disease or its precursor. The disease, similar to black lung disease and asbestosis, is fatal. Other workers have suffered from brain tumors, lung cancer, and other cancers that may have been caused by radiation exposure. The numbers are elusive due to factors that confound the identification of a disease exact cause, exemplified by workers with lung cancer who also smoked. The legacies of Rocky Flats reside beyond the local environment and people as well. During the plant's 37 years of weapons production, it manufactured plutonium bombs for most of the total 70,000 nuclear weapons produced by the United States. The Rocky Flats bombs, modern descendants of the plutonium bomb that destroyed Nagasaki, Japan in 1945, serve primarily as detonators for much more powerful thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs, H-bombs. Today, plutonium bombs manufactured at Rocky Flats remain in the cores of the approximately 10,000 nuclear weapons comprising the U.S. arsenal. So now I'm going to skip to the positive part. If society is to learn anything from Rocky Flats, workers must disavow the Cold War heroes talk and create a new narrative. Much of that new dialogue has been pushed by people outside the workers' ranks. For example, the employee for government contractor Kaiser Hill, Inc., who declared a few years ago that, quote, the Cold War heroes need to be turned into cleanup heroes. Former Rocky Flats workers and managers should acknowledge and take responsibility for manufacturing weapons of mass destruction, not devices or units or triggers that put the world at risk. A new storyline about Rocky Flats also demands an admission from citizens who are outside the plant's security fences. Activists, neighbors, journalists, and others must acknowledge that we, as citizens of a democracy, bear responsibility for the fact that U.S. national security ironically rested and still rests on nuclear weapons of mass destruction. When Rocky Flats produced weapons, the men and women at the plant functioned under the same national policy as everyone else. They weren't morally deficient. They were the public's surrogates. A new narrative would be an important start toward helping us think seriously about removing humanity from the endangered species list. Rocky Flats can serve as a real model for healing the nuclear weapons malady, a cleanup of its mess without a cover-up of its past.
Sarah, would you be next to that? Remember working while we're sitting front.
Yeah, in a quirky alphabet.
Well, thanks. It's always great to be at a Center of the American West event. And it was really fun to participate in this project, especially the group editing session, which was more fun than most editing sessions. And even more fun than that. It was actually quite fun. So my chapter is a piece of a larger study I did of the effects of federal judicial decisions on the Navajo Nation's exercise of its sovereign powers. And this chapter, in particular, talked about the results of my study with respect to the Navajo Nation's power to tax. And so I'm going to skip over most of the material actually discussing the taxing power for probably obvious reasons. But, I mean, it's fascinating to me, and I hope you all buy the book and read the middle part. But so I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction and the end. I attended elementary and high school in northern New Jersey, and despite the progressive Sesame Street-like atmosphere of my relatively racially integrated education, which I now realize was really rare, I was really lucky, it offered only two basic narratives about American Indians. The first was the Little House on the Prairie narrative. It goes like this. American Indians are beautiful but frightening savages who had to yield to the higher purposed and better use of the land by white settlers. It's a progress narrative with a sad nod to the necessary losses incurred. It's epitomized in a scene from the second book in the series by Laura Ingalls Wilder, the one actually entitled Little House on the Prairie, in which Laura and her family watch in quiet awe as a long line of Indians streams south and west past the Ingalls homestead, having been told by the federal government once again to move on. Even Ma, the most blatant Indian hater in the family, which I realized going back to look at the book again, Ma was really virulent against the Indians, seemed touched by the poignancy of what they have wrought. The second narrative is similar to the Little House narrative, but adds another dollop of both romanticism and guilt. Although not terribly original, it makes sense to call this one the Dances with Wolves narrative. It goes like this. American Indians were a purer form of human being than whites, with better attitudes towards nature and a freer way of living. But we conquered them to make this country what it is, and should feel very badly about that. Both narratives put a vast distance between us, the white settler conquerors, and them, the romantic savages. And both narratives present American Indians in the past tense. They were here, they were in the way, now they're gone. We may feel either slightly or very sad about that, but that's the way it is. The counter-narrative is not available in popular fiction, television shows, or Hollywood films, yet it can be found by spending time within the boundaries of a modern American Indian nation, working, talking, and living with modern American Indians. They're here, Their tattered homelands have become their fonts of cultural survival, and their separate political existence, known as their tribal sovereignty, is crucial to their ability to continue to live in the present as American Indians, as separate peoples with ties to their past and hope for their futures. And so then the middle is the study of the scintillating exercise of the power to tax. And then here's a little bit from the end. The story of the Navajo power to tax probably will not be made into a screenplay anytime soon, nor will it become a book series that captures non-Indian children's imaginations. It is, however, a nuanced story about a group of Americans who have lived in the West for a long time and are hoping to heal their own wounds. By telling this story, perhaps we can heal a wound in the dominant society as well, a wound caused by the violence and colonialism at the core of our Western experience, which we dress thinly in narratives imbued with guilt. The new narrative is an action tale about survival and adaptation. It may be less romantic, and in the case of taxation, may even be annoyingly bureaucratic, but it has the upside of being true.
My essay is about a ritual, a ceremonial event that was introduced by the Spanish in the early colonial period. And in New Mexico, it's among both indigenous and Hispano populations, and turns out that this same genre is also in Mexico and also in Puerto Rico and also in Colombia and also in Peru and in Brazil. And I'm currently doing fieldwork in Colombia, and I've done a lot of work in Mexico as well on this matachines. I'm sorry, I'm Brenda Romero. I'm sorry. And I'm an ethnomusicologist in the College of Music. So ethnomusicology is like anthropology and musicology together. Okay. So it's a big learning curve if you've studied composition like I did before. So I'm still learning. When I started doing work on my dissertation, I went to the Pueblo of Jemez because they had two different versions of this dance, one accompanied by guitar and violin, and the other one immediately followed by drum and chorus, which is traditional. And I wanted to know what that was about. I wasn't able to write about that in my dissertation, but it has informed a lot of my work since then. But what I'm going to read about today is what happened when I went there and the old fiddler was dying of cancer, and I didn't quite know what to do, but it became very clear in a very short time. I arrived at the Pueblo of Jemez to begin my field work on December 12th of 1987, the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I had become a devotee of Our Lady in 1983 when my sister was suffering from a fatal illness, so in some ways I felt called by Our Lady on this day. The fiddler for the Pueblo Matachina, as they call it, Adelaido Martinez, who was Hispano, and traditionally it was the Hispano fiddlers who would perform at the Pueblos. Adelaido was also suffering from a terminal illness. I was able to find him at his home, however, and he and his wife, Maria Martinez Santos, were gracious enough to allow me to interview them. Adelaido died the following July. Around the same time, I had a dream that I would have to play the violin 10 minutes a day. I returned to Jemez exactly a year later on December 12, 1988, and again on January 1st, 1989, when a Marine home for the holidays at the Pueblo shot and killed one young person and permanently injured another. I became convinced that disruption in the ceremonial calendar contributed to disruption in the Pueblo in general. According to anthropologist Victor Turner, processes mediated by procedures, established ways of doing things, are set in train, the aim of which is to diffuse tension, assess irrational deeds against standards of reasonableness, and to reconcile conflicting parties, having convinced them through showing them the damaging effects of their actions on group unity, that it is better to restore a state of peace than to continue in a state of hostility. End quote. The Matachina comprised an important set of procedures that had been absent for 2 years already since the onset of Adelaido's illness. After that, After all that Native people have lost, one more loss is not insignificant, especially one established in the ritual calendar with its attendant cultural processes and ritual processes. I approached Pueblo Governor Randolph Padilla about the possibility of my learning the pieces so that the ceremony might continue, and he granted approval. He was also one of the lead Matachina dancers at that time. Of course, this opportunity was potentially an excellent field experience for me, but it was also a chance to return something to the people while working on my dissertation. All that year, I took lessons from the violin teaching assistant in the College of Music at CU, transcribing the complicated little ornamental figures with her assistants. I play guitar and sing. Okay. Violin was very difficult for me. At this particular time of year, when College of Music performance faculty and faculty in other areas such as art and architecture were conducting juries, I too had to perform for a jury. On the first occasion that I went to play for the December 12th feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, I entered the men's hall for the first time a couple of days beforehand. Men of all ages sat on the bench built out of the wall around the room and listened while I played the ancient Iberian melodies on the violin, accompanied by the Pueblo guitarist Daniel Culaque, who had been the Matachina guitarist for decades, in spite of belonging to the opposite kiva. As I played each melody more or less intact, faces lit up and the excitement built until it seemed that everyone was smiling. The war chiefs nodded and we began the rehearsal in earnest. I subsequently played for 9 years, during which time Daniel Culaque died and Adelaido Martinez's grandson took over on the guitar. An excellent musician, 17-year-old Lawrence Trujillo soon began to prepare the violin pieces with my coaching on the fastest and most complicated sequences. In the meantime, 2 other Pueblo members learned to play 1 or 2 of the melodies on the violin, and I began to defer to them on those pieces whenever possible. One of them, Kathleen Gauchupin, became a regular on the slow monarca sequence. By September 1998, Lawrence, then 19, played all of the pieces for me. So realizing that he was ready, I told him that I would not perform that year and he would have to play. He's done very well and still defers to Kathleen on 1 or 2 pieces for most performances. I, in turn, headed south to the international border to expand my research, again on December 12th, the day on which the borderlands Matachinas are most active. The Matachinas danza was originally introduced to evangelize the Indians, a point that is not lost to the Puebloans. Discussing the ways that symbols are often inverted to create ritual meaning, Victor Turner submits that one aspect of symbolic inversion may be to break people out of their culturally defined, even biologically ascribed roles by making them play precisely the opposite roles. Among Native people of North America in general, received rituals were typically performed in the past in order to acquire the power that they brought to their originating group. So a neighboring group sometimes still gives a song or dance to aid their friends with its healing power. Seen as formulaic, such songs and dances were performed as closely as possible to the original versions. The Spanish, for their own reasons, took their roles as teachers of the dance seriously and coached the dancers on the correct read Spanish form and dance steps. Notwithstanding the formulaic aspect of things, both Matachina music and ceremonial dress have changed over time to conform with Pueblo practices, which tend to confirm that enacting the other's ritual diffuses the otherness, making them more like us through the mediation of the ritual itself, as Turner suggests. And the rest of the essay is around that, what New Mexican Hispano culture is and how it is kind of all mixed up together. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Joe Ryan. I teach and do research in environmental engineering at the University of Colorado here. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Patty and the Center for getting me involved in this project, getting me over the steep cliff and burning moats of oil that separate the School of Engineering from the rest of the college. It was a real pleasure to meet and interact and work with some people from the rest of the school after many years here not really getting out of engineering. My chapter in this book is called Cleaning Up Abandoned Hard Rock Mines in Western United States. Can and will communities take the lead? And it evolved from some involvement that my students and I had right here in Boulder County in the left-hand creek watershed, where a lot of old mines have polluted the water, made it a bad place if you're a fish, and possibly even threatened the drinking water supplies of people in unincorporated Boulder County. So I'm going to start from the beginning here. I had a little trouble picking anything out because when I realized what I was trying to read, it was hitched to everything else. Anybody ever heard that before? So let me start. Back in 1858, a party of settlers in horse-drawn wagons followed the South Platte River west across the Nebraska Territory to Pikes Peak in search of gold. They paused at Fort St. Vrain on the river for a view of the red sandstone peaks of the 300-million-year-old fountain formation that rise behind the valley that now holds Boulder, Colorado. These peaks, now known as the Flatirons, inspired the leader of the group, Thomas Akins, a practical and focused man, to render his assessment of the locale's utility. The mountains look good for gold, and the valleys look good for grazing. Akins' party proceeded to 4 Mile Canyon, established a camp, and began mining the stream for gold. Using pans, rockers, sluice boxes, they harvested gold float from the stream gravels and traced the gold back to quartz veins in the hills above Boulder, near what is now the town of Gold Hill. And over the following decade, prospectors found gold, silver, and other metals, mainly in telluride, a mixture of gold, silver, and other metals with the metal tellurium, a little chemistry tonight, in the surrounding mountains. In what would become Boulder County, the mining districts and towns of Ward, Jamestown, Magnolia, Wall Street, Salina, Sugarloaf, Sunshine, and Sunset were settled. Back in 1992, just after I graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a PhD in environmental engineering, my wife Martha and I made our way to Boulder in a 24-foot budget rent-a-truck on Interstate 70. That's worth a book right there. On the Boulder Turnpike, just south of the city, we paused for a view of the Flatirons from the scenic outlook. But we weren't thinking of gold as we looked over the Boulder Valley, despite a definite paucity of riches after 7 years in graduate school. Instead, I came to teach and do research at the university, and Martha came for a master's degree in fine arts. We came to do a little skiing, biking, and hiking too. For us, Boulder meant higher education and recreation, not mining. As proof of my ignorance of Boulder's mining history, it took me 10 years to find the lone figure dedicated to miners of Boulder County, whose stories are carried on the winds of time. That's a quote from a plaque on the bronze statue of a miner by the east side of the Boulder County Courthouse. It took me 6 years of driving the 20 miles from Boulder to our home in what's called the Bar K Ranch subdivision west of Jamestown, a mountain subdivision at nearly 9,000 feet of elevation, to realize that I had been passing the abandoned head frames, shaft houses, mills, and waste rock piles of the Jamestown mining district. This mining district, also called Jimtown, was once the temporary home of some 10,000 miners, according to various historical reports. But only about 300 now live in the town that the U.S. Postal Service insisted on calling Jamestown. So what did it finally take me to recognize the mining history of Boulder County? It was the promises, or threats, depending on one's perspective, of a cleanup of the mines by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So the chapter goes on from there to tell about the story of how the EPA, everybody assumed the EPA would come in and try to dictate a solution. Various people in the area responded to that in a way of trying to push the EPA away, and ultimately that caused a lot of problems in finally getting things cleaned up. So, thank you for your attention.
We have Alan Wallace. Should we? Sorry. The W's are coming into play here.
Yeah, I'm Alan Wallace, and I'm the interloper from the Denver campus. I teach in the School of Public Affairs, but I used to teach here in what's now the College of Architecture and Planning, and this chapter is co-authored by Gene Bressler, who at the time was chairman of the Landscape Architecture program on the Denver campus, and is now chairman of the Landscape Architecture program at North Carolina State. So we began this essay because we knew that it had to have historical roots. And by contrasting Territorial Governor Gilpin's image of the West, particularly the Intermountain West, as a land of infinite abundance, you only had to throw seeds on the bare ground, and they would bear fruit. And it's an image that, as you read it, you wonder, where is he talking about? And this was contrasted by John Wesley Powell's image of the West as a fragile environment whose resources need to be carefully stewarded. And we make the argument that these two images of the West, a land of infinite abundance where you don't really have to care about your abuse, and a land that's very fragile where you have to be very careful, still continue in the development patterns today. So our essay is called Give Me Land, Lots of Land, and this is a section called The Expeditious Landscape. Many planners, design professionals, educators, and lay consumers argue that we can or should do a better job of planning and stewarding urban growth in the West. They believe that it is desirable, if not simply imperative, to provide alternative landscape development paradigms to accommodate future urban growth. These new approaches need to reflect better the diversity yet unique cultural and physical attributes of the region, while simultaneously providing affordable, attractive, safe communities responsive to the needs and wants of diverse population. But there's a problem in introducing a new paradigm of development, as revealed in a series of design studios conducted by Jean Bressler beginning in 2002 through 2005. As the practitioners and mentors involved in this studio explained, the standard subdivision design has a great deal of inertia behind it, resulting in what participants in the design studio came to call the expeditious landscape. Its form, economics, and development processes are formulaic and under normal circumstances highly predictable. Daring to deviate from the standard according to, quote, common knowledge is fiscally perilous. So the development community and the buying public's aversion to risk have perpetuated the notion of the expeditious landscape. Why be exposed to more risk when the buying public and the public entitlement process accepts the business-as-usual formula? Residential development is a high-risk enterprise for all stakeholders, builders, developers, municipalities, and consumers. Vast sums of money are made and often lost. According to conventional thinking within the development community, deviation from the standard development model increases developer risk, which can be mitigated only with increased prices for the consumer. It therefore follows that it must be best to play it safe, development as usual. But is that the best strategy in the long run? Let's examine the notion of development risk. 4 major risk factors have impacted and continue to impact the development landscape. 1, the time cost of money. The longer it takes to bring a project through the development process, from entitlements to exactions, staff review, public scrutiny, the project approval, the greater the cost in terms of interest on development loans. A known product, such as the standard subdivision, involves less scrutiny and therefore requires a shorter review or approval time. It's familiar. It raises fewer questions. Why? Because we've done it a million times. Second risk, consumer demand. Consumers and their mortgage institutions are comfortable with known products, such as standard subdivisions. Subdivisions that have a proven and predictable track record as measured in terms of resales and property value. Consumer demand is increasingly fueled by speculators who buy homes just to flip them for a quick profit. Such buyers favor a generic product that has little interest in alternative design or offering operating design cost savings. Third risk, economic scale. Smaller, local builders and developers find it difficult to compete with much larger national players. The national development and building corporations have substantial financial backing afforded by being part of publicly traded corporations. Access to Wall Street capital markets provides them with cheap money. For development and construction, these corporations have the financial means to endure the increasingly longer development entitlement processes and have the clout to buy building materials and appliances such as furnaces, stoves, in huge quantities. As a consequence, they tend to be less responsive to variations in regional environment. They also tend to offer the same proven development product, regardless of region or location. Although they work to stay competitive, they usually avoid radical development innovations because doing so is likely to increase the exposure to risk, especially during times when having the proven value of something new to nervous stockholders and the money markets may at face value be unwise. And finally, litigation and neighborhood protests. Community opposition to projects take the form of not in my backyard or NIMBY protests, and attendant litigation can significantly delay development. Although one might expect that a community would welcome sustainable design alternatives, especially on vacant infill sites, opposition occurs when a community is faced with the possibility of increased densities as well as more congested roads, schools, and playgrounds. By contrast, developing a subdivision on a green field and open agricultural land is far less likely to provoke such opposition and its attendant delays. In sum, adversity to risk and a desire for predictable returns on investment contributes to the production of the expeditious landscape. And we go on a more hopeful note. This is only the beginning. We go on to suggest that there are local developers who are, in fact, developing subdivisions, residential subdivisions, in a way that are trying to be sustainable. But it's really an uphill battle because large national builders with Wall Street money behind them really just sort of roll over any attempt to create subdivisions that reflect the characteristics of the landscape that's local and perhaps consumer demand that's more local.
I'm Sharon Collinge, one of the editors of this book, and I'd like to just echo what Patty began with, which is this is a really great book. And after we went through the whole editing process, I had read each of these chapters several times. The book arrived in early summer, late spring, early summer, and I decided I was just going to take it out and read it from start to finish. And I enjoyed it so much. It was just wonderful to see this again from a fresh perspective, so I hope you'll all enjoy it. I want to say thank you to Buzzy Jackson, who's here, who I'll use another word. I think she rejuvenated us in the final stages of this project, and as you all know, the final stages of a project are pretty difficult, and getting actually all the way finished can be nearly impossible, and I think Buzzy saved us, so thank you. So my role tonight is to talk about some of the big ideas that we found emerging from these essays as editors and from this investigation of healing landscapes, histories, and cultures, and to share with you some thoughts of ours from the introduction. I'd like to emphasize that this is a very diverse collection of essays, as you've already seen. There are several others that you haven't heard, authors that you haven't heard from. So I'm really proud of being a part of this project. So let's start with some of these big ideas. The first is that each moment of conflict is unique in some way, as is each potential solution. But each chapter seeks to draw generalizable lessons for its field from its particular case study. And each also attempts to reach out across disciplines, regions, and issues to offer suggestions and parallels that tie together the West's problems and their solutions. So again, emphasizing that each of these projects, each of these case studies is unique, but I think each author has done an excellent job of trying to draw generalizations from their study. Secondly, perhaps the theme that ties these chapters together most closely is that of people. Behind every problem in this book, whether in the area of hydrology or ecology or ceremonial dance or civic engineering or linguistics, there are people. But every solution is also finally a people solution. This is ultimately then where politics comes into play, which leads to the third big idea. In the past, many academics have taken the attitude that politics is someone else's problem. Scholars, the story goes, should provide their technical insight to those concerned, then step back and allow the fray to begin from there. But this attitude is increasingly questioned today. This volume is fundamentally committed to the idea that the narrowly defined experts in a given field can also participate in the larger social and political process involved. The people process in addressing the problems in question. Almost every chapter thus includes not just a scholarly perspective on a problem, but a personal human perspective as well. And I think that's obvious from the stories that you've heard tonight. In addressing the issues surrounding remedies for a New West, many of us realized that there is much uncertainty in this process. And so I'd like to end by sharing an excerpt from my own essay regarding the uncertain promise of ecological restoration. A restoration case study, vernal pools in Northern California. Vernal pools are ephemeral wetland habitats that typically occur in areas with Mediterranean climates. During the wet winters, these basin-like depressions in the landscape fill with rainwater, supporting a diverse array of invertebrates such as fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. During the dry spring, flowering plants take their turn in the pools, producing a spectacular display of yellow, purple, and white. These vernal pools harbor high biological diversity, but have declined in abundance by more than 90%, due primarily to agricultural and urban development. They are thus currently found in very few spots in California. Because of their rarity, conservation of existing vernal pools and restoration of pools that once existed will be critical aspects of maintaining the rich biological diversity supported in these habitats. For the past 8 years, I have conducted research on vernal pool ecology and restoration in Northern California. My research contributes mixed messages to the conversation about restoring native habitats. My restoration efforts involved painstakingly collecting seeds of rare plant species from a relatively intact vernal pool habitat and using them to jumpstart 256 newly excavated vernal pool basins near the same site. This large-scale restoration experiment was designed to investigate if and how vernal pool plant communities can be restored. Because it was known that the study sites historically supported vernal pools, I assumed that the substrate was intact. For vernal pools to function, there must be a relatively impermeable clay layer underneath the soil surface that doesn't allow water to percolate through the soil. This substrate causes the water to pond for several months on the soil surface, creating the pool. No major natural disturbances were known for this ecosystem, so there was no need to reintroduce disturbance. Although naturally occurring pools existed at the study site, many vernal pool plants have limited dispersal ability. Thus, I reasoned that planting seeds collected from the site would be essential for restoration. Finally, the upland areas surrounding the vernal pools are dominated by non-native invasive grass species. However, few of these species are able to tolerate the seasonal inundation of the vernal pool basins and thus are not able to compete. So I made no attempt to control them. In the 8 years since the inception of this restoration experiment, I have visited the restored pools in the winter to record the water levels during the seasonal flooding of the pools, and in the spring to record the plants present in the plots where I planted seeds of native species. Results thus far show that in some of the pools, the depth of water and the duration of inundation during the winter wet season mimic those found in the naturally occurring pools at the site. In these pools that exhibit the appropriate hydrological function, the native plants that I seeded into the pools are thriving. The rarest of the rare plant species, a federally endangered member of the sunflower family, grows only where I have planted it. It cannot colonize new pools on its own so far. In about 1/3 of the restored pools, vernal pool plants do not have sustained populations because the environmental conditions, hydrologically speaking, do not appear to mimic real pools closely enough. These encouraging but modest findings suggest that we may still be a long way from having on hand a reliable instruction manual on vernal pool restoration. In truth, it would be nice to work with less sense of urgency and timing. Wouldn't it be logical to halt further destruction of vernal pool habitat until we learn more about the process of restoration?
So I'm Andy Cowell from linguistics, and my job is actually just to try to react a little bit to everybody's. There we go.
I'll just react is to react to everybody's essays a little bit and kind of do what Sharon did, which is share some of the things I found from reading the book. But I'll just say briefly what my own work has been on, which is Native American languages. Go on. Okay. So I'll just keep talking. Looks like things are okay. So I work on Native American languages, and I am interested in the fact that they are disappearing, or concerned about the fact that they're disappearing. And so what I try to do is to document those languages. And I work in particular on the Northern Plains with the Arapaho, the Gros Ventre, the Cheyenne. And when I gave my talk, I talked about the problems in preserving Native American languages. About 90% of them are likely to disappear within the next 100 years. So what should or what can we in the general public and in academia do about this problem of these disappearing Native American languages? And there's two issues that are involved, one of which is documentation. And so one thing that I do is I just try to record as much of these languages as possible, get that written down, transcribed, take notes, and understand all the different vocabulary, the structures, the stories of the language. The other thing, however, is transmission. Right? It's great for me to transcribe and document, but that doesn't mean anybody's necessarily learning the language. And so the issue is how do we get kids to learn Native American languages? Because that's the problem. That's why they're disappearing. Kids are not learning them. So I talked about a tension that goes on between my efforts at documentation and my efforts at teaching kids, helping parents teach kids, help teachers, and so forth and so on. And how do those fit together? But let me step back from that and say that I think the biggest lesson I think that this book suggests is kind of what Sharon just ended on. Right? There's a very obvious lesson that it's a lot less expensive and a lot easier not to screw things up in the first place. Right? And that's something I think that many of these essays do a good job of showing. I'll just refer to one, for example, on the Klamath Basin and endangered fish. And it's a really fascinating essay because it shows how incredibly complex it is to save endangered fish. And all kinds of scientific work was done and all kinds of water studies and water manipulation. Everybody thought they had the problem solved. They did everything they thought the scientists told them to do, and it still didn't work. And then there's another round in 20, 30 years. So it's just a really fascinating study of why you don't want to get to that point if you can avoid it. But at the same time, what are we trying to save becomes a real key issue. So we're saying don't mess something up, but what is it we don't want to mess up? And what I've really come to see in these essays is that it's processes that we don't want to mess up. And as Sharon was saying, and as another essay talks about with ecosystems, an ecosystem is the result of many kinds of processes, of soil formation, of rainfall patterns, of temperature patterns, in some cases of disturbance, the existence of predators. If the predators aren't there, the prey get more numerous, they eat up certain plants, certain birds that use those plants disappear. So there's all kinds of processes that are necessary to sustain an ecosystem. But the same thing's true about a language. Right? A language is a product of people living in a certain environment, carrying on certain cultural activities, having a certain identity, sharing certain stories, and so forth and so on. And I think it becomes very important in these essays to realize that that the processes that produced the music in the Jemez Pueblo, for example, are what need to continue. People need to learn and continue practicing that. Recording it is one thing, but recording it hasn't necessarily saved the music. I mean, it's saved it in an archive, but it's not living. And my own feeling with documenting native languages, it's great to have dozens and dozens of hours in archives, and that's worthwhile, but at the same time, the language is not living. So then, in terms of process, I want to add one more term, which is diversity. And I think an unspoken issue in all of these essays, to me, is the importance of diversity. And that's often an academic buzzword. But I think one example that maybe is less academic, we all think about our states in the United States, and every state is a laboratory for experimentation and a place in which people in Connecticut can try solutions to problems that aren't working in California and so forth and so on. But as you said, the Navajo Nation is a sovereign nation. So there's all these little laboratories of government, laboratories of social experiments in our country. And if we can sustain those and reinforce the tribal sovereignty, the taxing powers and so forth and so on, there's a new approach to government, a new approach to managing wildlife and landscapes, a new approach to organizing society that's available for us to look at. We could also talk about housing diversity. I mean, that comes up in the discussion, right? I mean, are we all going to have the same houses all over the country, or are we going to experiment with local housing processes and adaptation to the environment? So diversity comes out in all these ways: language, history, and so forth and so on. But to tie these two together now, the idea of process and the idea of diversity, the diversity we see today in this country, whether it's the Native American languages I'm interested in, or the music that's arisen in New Mexico, or the different tribal groups, or the ecological diversity that Sharon talked about, it's a result of a long historical process. Right? So we tend often to look at the world around us in terms of what we see right now. And we tend to forget that what we see now is the product of hundreds of years of cultures adapting, of environments evolving, of Cold War confrontation, and all these kinds of things. So I think that the one thing that Patty has really stressed to all the people in the Valley, and I think it's come through very clearly, is we as academics need to look at the history of the processes that have happened. To see how we got to where we're at today. And simply saying, well, that landscape is diverse, let's put a fence around it and preserve it, it doesn't work, right? Because you have to understand that landscape diversity evolved through a process that has been continuing for hundreds of years and needs to continue for hundreds of years more. Likewise, the Pueblo music, right, has evolved through a set of cultural meetings and mergings, and that also needs to continue. So if we really want to preserve this diversity that all of these essays pick up on and make such a powerful statement for its value, then we need to preserve the processes that produce that diversity and the processes that will continue to produce that diversity. So that's a kind of an abstract statement, but how do we continue to preserve processes that will produce the diversity that's so valuable to us, whether it's diversities of lifestyle, of political perspective, of music, of language, all these kinds of things. So the lesson becomes, in a way, we can't freeze the present. So things will always continue to evolve, but how do we let them evolve as richly as possible, as differently as possible, as powerfully as possible? So I believe, to pick up on the theme of the book, which is Remedies for a New West, that one of the big lessons that comes out of this is health, if we want to take that, landscape health, social health, cultural health, is diversity production, or the enabling of continued diversity. That's what really makes our culture, our landscape, strong, resilient, able to react, able to adjust, able to move us forward. So you see that, in a way, the history of the past informs our understanding of the present, and our understanding of the present can hopefully inform our ability to empower the continuation of these processes in the present that will maintain resiliency. And that then leads me to two final conclusions, and I'll try to illustrate with my own work. On the one hand, we've heard that academics need to get more involved in the public arena, and I certainly think that's true, and the book is a good argument for how we can do that. At the same time, I want to, and this may be responding a little bit to what Patty said, maybe slightly disagreeing, as I look at my own work, I find that as an academic person, I'm very good at documenting what's here now. Okay? And I'm very good at looking at the history of the past and seeing how what's here got here, and understanding the evolution of languages and the meetings of cultures and the shifts Native Americans have gone through to get to where they are today. But I find it very frustrating that I'm not more able to enable the communities I work with to carry on their language and to teach it to the children. And I certainly am involved with that and working hard with that, but I have to recognize as an academic there's a limitation to how much I can do. Ultimately, the community will have to decide whether they want to preserve their language. And I can be a doctor in a certain sense, an enabler, but I can't be, well, not even a doctor, I can be a counselor, but I can't be a healer. However, by doing the documentation work I do, which sometimes seems useless, right? It's like, yeah, you're documenting a language, but it's going to be dead. So what? No one's going to speak it. Who's going to read these books? Who's going to appreciate these recordings? But there are many examples around the world where languages are now being revived that were extinct. And there are certainly examples in ecology where ecosystems are being revived that had ceased to function. And examples of historical information about things like Rocky Flats, or there's a very good essay about the deep history of Mexican Americans in the United States from John Michael Rivera. A lot of these essays show the ability to bring things back, to rejuvenate, which goes beyond this metaphor of healing to resuscitation, revivification. And I think that one of the things that academics can do that's very powerful is, in fact, to document languages, to document ecological diversity, to document music in the present. And the reason I think it's so important is because it gives people time and it gives people choices. And Sharon mentioned the pressure of time with endangered species. But what I see is, with the Arapaho, for example, that I work with, 50 years from now, who knows what can happen? The Arapaho people may decide, even if they lose their language today and cease speaking it, we're going to revive it, just like the Israeli people revived Hebrew. Who knows what's going to happen in the California Central Valley? Maybe people will start tearing out vineyards and, rebuilding vernal pools because they love those beautiful endangered flowers, right? Who knows what happens at Rocky Flats and, what kind of lessons can be produced? We can't know what's going to happen, right, as academics. And in fact, if we're interested in processes, then by definition, we don't know where those processes are going to go. We want to keep them working, and that's all we can do, is try to help, as a culture, in fact, a society, to keep these processes working and see where they go. But one place they can go is this reconstruction, revivification, revival. However, if we in the academic community don't document these languages, or don't record the music, or don't save the documents around Rocky Flats, don't do the oral history interviews, don't get those museum specimens into the herbarium for where are the endangered plants and which ones are where and which ones lives in what level of water. If that's not done today, then down the road, people will not have the choice to revive, to rebuild, to revivify, to rejuvenate. It will not be possible because the information just will not be there. Now, I don't know if anybody is going to use, my work on the Grobant language from Montana 100 years from now or not. But by doing the documentation, I'm giving people a choice. And Brenda, for example, has given the Jimenez Pueblo a choice, right? If she had not learned that music and passed it on, it would not be there today. And there'd be no way to get it back if it wasn't recorded. They can still decide they don't want to do it anymore, right? I mean, that's not your job to tell them that. But at the same time, you've given them the choice to continue. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And I think that's something that universities, museums, archives, libraries, scholars can really make a major contribution for the future and give a little more time for the endangered species or the endangered culture or the endangered practice. But of course, to conclude and to pick up on the real important theme of the Center of the American West in general, all this information is no good unless it gets out there, right? So the archive closed to the public and unused doesn't give anybody any choices or any practices. So I think that the theme really of the center has been to try to take that knowledge and get it out into the public so that those choices are available to people and those processes can continue as richly as possible. So I think that's really, maybe for me personally, the lessons that have come out of the book. Thank you.
Mr. Miller's fine. So we must all look before we reach steps. That's what we've learned from that, but he's fine. So thank you, everybody. If there may be one or two questions, but then we do have books for sale, and we have more authors than you will ever have at a book signing for one book. And it just seems like a terrible thing not to harvest that incredible resource of books will weigh more just by the ink that is placed upon them by the autographs. But are there any one or two comments from anyone in the audience who wants to ask anything from the co-editors? I hope you get a sense of really what a cool thing this is, of all these folks coming together.
Subtitle?
Yes.
Are you seeking to heal histories and heal cultures?
Well, here's a ridiculous situation. Edward Abbey had a friend named Jack Leffler, who we all like a great deal. He's a wonderful man. He's a folklorist. And he compiled a book called Healing the West, which came out after we had chosen the title Healing the West. So what is now the subtitle was supposed to be the main title. And then the people at the University of Arizona Press pointed out to us that there was a book now called Healing the West, and ridiculously, I am one of the people interviewed and profiled in Jack Leffler's book. So I scooped myself, or I don't know. So the healing in there is really a reference to the title we were hoping to have, Healing the West. And in fact, by the time we discovered that, my epilogue is really very much about that metaphor. Because as you'll notice, we picked a funny one there, that the healthcare system of the United States is not overwhelmingly celebrated at this point in time. So we actually picked medical science, which is a little bit funny given the way in which medical science is up for some critical notions there. So yes, it is healing landscapes, healing histories, and healing cultures, but it was supposed to be a broader cast, Healing the West. I'm not sure if that answers it. But I love Jack Leffler, so I cannot be mad. Jack Leffler, speaking of Rocky Flats and all these issues, Jack Leffler, who's just a remarkable and kind of a folklorist, sort of self-taught, yes, but he had been stationed at the Nevada test site as a young man. And he was in the group that was supposed to run forward. As soon as the atomic bomb was tested, he was supposed to be part of the troops running forward to occupy the site and play the trumpet. So Jack Leffler would play the trumpet, and then they would all charge out there. So Jack Leffler can have my house if he wants. I mean, my titles and stuff. So that's a long answer, but it looked better when it was the main title, but then he's a wonderful man. Yeah.
Are you going to do a book tour throughout the West? Or
a book tour? We're going next door to my Overton's library. The university presses are having tough times financially, so that's not going to happen, the book tour. But I don't know. I guess I'm grateful that you mentioned that, because I do go around giving speeches, and I'm sure I could make that one of the conditions of my giving a speech somewhere is, I will give your speech, but it'll be important to have a little stand out there with it. So, and anyone else is doing that might be an interesting idea to say, I'll be there. And so the answer is no, but thank you so much for asking that, because I think we could actually...
I just think the topics are so... it's not just front range of Colorado.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right, and I think that the corrective to the fatalism is so great and not easy to find in the rest of the world. So, okay, so now whenever I go to give a speech, a new condition has been added. Yes?
Can we request these at our local libraries?
You should certainly request these at your local libraries. You should storm your local libraries. You should just be... you should have signs. So yes, by all means. It is a really interesting world, the world of book publishing, and maybe this should be a website. But there's something very nice about having it in this material form. And I know I'm a dinosaur on this count, but it just seems really great that all of these enterprises that you can hold it and carry it and reread it. And I'm so with Sharon that we just... There they all were, all of those essays in different stages. And again, Buzzy was so spectacular in helping us with that. But then to get the book and to think, well, it makes sense and it hangs together and it really has a spirit that's very nice. So yes, please go to your libraries point out an absence if there is an absence.
Talking about the diversity and just some of the topics you touched on, I bought my house because it was about a half a block from our local library, and I didn't want my kids to ever have an excuse that there was no quiet place to study. So talking about how you decide where to buy a house or where to live, in a housing development or whatever, that was just my number one criteria. Now they're 22 and 26, and there's some kids.
Great. Good. Then you have standing in those. That's great. So, any other comments or questions, or should we get to autographing and chatting? And obviously, many an author to speak to here. So, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your company a lot.